Civilizations love origin stories. Rome suckled by a wolf. America pulled up by its bootstraps, while quietly stepping on someone else's boots. And ancient Israel? A liberation epic. People oppressed in Egypt, dramatic showdown with a pharaoh, plagues, sea parting, freedom march, laws on a mountaintop, the works. If you pitched it to a studio, they'd say tone it down. Too many set pieces. The question is not whether this story mattered, because it did and still does. The question is whether it went down the way the box office version says. Did a mass of Hebrews get enslaved in Egypt, escape in one miraculous event, camp for decades, then conquer Canaan in a single campaign? Or is the historical reality more like one of those based on a true story movies where the true story is a receipt and a shrug? Let's pull the curtain. History, unlike faith, runs on receipts. In this case, the receipts would look like Egyptian records bragging about enslaving a group called Israelites/Hebrews, then moaning that they escaped. Spoiler: we don't have this. Archaeology, maybe trash layers, campsites, inscriptions in the Sinai desert showing a large population wandering for decades. Also missing corroborating texts from neighbors speaking about a big migration or a meltdown in Egypt that lines up with the biblical timeline. Nada. Instead, we have a pile of other stuff, good stuff, just not the smoking cartouche. Think of it like a crime scene where the fingerprints are smudged, but the motive, means, and opportunity are all over the place. Absolutely. Egypt in the late Bronze Age was a giant construction site with a bureaucratic soul. Pharaohs built cities, temples, and prestige like it was a national sport. That required bodies. Egypt had slavery and forced labor, with varieties, chattel slaves, war captives, corvée laborers who owed work to the state. Semitic populations living in the Nile Delta, turning up in texts, names, and art. People from Canaan and Syria weren't exotic. They were neighbors, migrants, merchants, sometimes captives. Massive projects in the eastern delta during the era of Ramesses II, 13th C. BCE, including Pyramus, a glittering capital mentioned in the Bible as Ramses. So the background of the Exodus story, Semitic groups in Egypt, some in bondage or coerced labor, fits the known world like a glove. That's the could. Historians want the did. The best pro-evidence they have is the Egyptian victory Stele boasts about smacking various groups in Canaan and casually drops, "Israel is laid waste, his seed is not." The translation of this is that by 1208 BCE, some group called Israel existed in Canaan. That means if there was an exodus, it had to be before this. It doesn't prove the escape, it proves the endpoint existed. The Brooklyn Papyrus and other lists we got Egyptian household and administrative documents listing servants/slaves with Semitic names. No, it doesn't say Hebrews building pyramids. But it shows Semitic people in Egyptian servitude. The social slot exists. The Habaru/Apiru problem Near Eastern letters talk about Habaru/Apiru. Mobile, marginal folks who fight, hire out, cause trouble, and take opportunities. Are they Hebrews? Not one-to-one. But linguistically and socially they're close cousins. It proves there were rootless, semi-outsider groups wandering around the very terrain where Israel's identity later crystallizes. The Habaru/Apiru problem. Near Eastern letters talk about Habaru/Apiru. Mobile, marginal folks who fight, hire out, cause trouble, and take opportunities. Are they Hebrews? Not one-to-one. But linguistically and socially they're close cousins. It proves there were rootless, semi-outsider groups wandering around the very terrain where Israel's identity later crystallizes. Place names with receipts. Ramses, in Exodus, points to Pyramus, bustling in the 13th century. That's a timestamp embedded in the story. Either the tale remembers a real setting, or someone later backfilled very specific flavor. The memory that cuts against the grain. National founding myths usually brag. This one starts with slavery and failure. That's a weird flex if you're inventing propaganda. Many scholars see this as a memory of misery expanded into an epic, because communities don't frame themselves as pathetic unless something painful is lodged in their bones. Egyptian silence. You want the pharaoh to admit he got clowned by a shepherd with a stick? Good luck. Egypt wrote for glory, not mea culpas. Still, the total silence on a mass escape is a problem if you want the max scale reading. We enslaved 1 million people and they nuked our economy with frogs. Would have made at least one grumpy inscription. The Sinai Desert, also silent. Archaeology is mean. It wants your trash. Hundreds of thousands of people camping for decades should leave latrines of evidence. Ash pits, broken pots, something. Surveys haven't found that kind of footprint. Nomads leave less, yes. But millions? That's not stealth. That's magic deletion. Numbers that don't add up. The Bible's 600,000 men on foot implies 2 million people total. That would have been larger than many states of the time. Feeding, moving, and marshalling that in the desert? Imagine Disneyland on July 4th without bathrooms. Historians read these figures as symbolic, the way ancient writers used numbers to shout, "Big deal." Canaan looks. Canaanite. When the dust settles in the highlands of Canaan, Iron Age the new Israelite villages look locally evolved. Same pottery DNA, similar house types, with some distinctive habits like fewer pig bones. It feels like Canaanites shifting identity, not an invading Egyptian diaspora sweeping in like a new faction. Popular builds. How scholars patch the lore. Theory A. Full tilt Exodus. A large enslaved group escapes under Moses in the 13th century BCE. Miracles are miracles. Silence is selective reporting. Archaeology missed the camps. This is the traditional religious read. The strength of this theory is it takes the text straight. The weakness of this theory asks you to ignore the quiet desert and the quiet Egyptians. Theory B is a micro-exodus. A smaller group of Semites, oppressed laborers or slaves, really did flee Egypt. Their story, raw and potent, later becomes the national origin of a people that mostly coalesced inside Canaan. Numbers and spectacle grow in retelling. The strength of this theory is it fits the social reality, salvages the memory, doesn't fight the archaeologists. The weakness of this theory is you trade one big miracle for a long, messy formation, less cinematic. Theory C. Hyksos Echo. Centuries earlier, Semitic Hyksos rulers were expelled from Egypt around 1600 BC. Maybe some cultural echo of that expulsion got remixed into Exodus. Foreigners out, God in, Pharaoh outwitted. The strength of this theory is there was a real Semitic exit. The weakness of this theory is the timeline is off compared to Ramesside details and the Merneptah end dat. Theory D. Myth with teeth. The Exodus is a theological charter composed or finalized much later, monarchy or exile. Egypt is a stage for teaching, we know oppression, we choose justice. The scaffolding borrows genuine Egyptian color without a single blockbuster event behind it. The strength of this theory explains why the story is morally perfect. The weakness of this theory hand-waves the stubborn Egyptian Ramses, flavor and the peculiar pride in a shameful past. Why the story stuck and keeps sticking. Look, not all myths are created equal. Some brag. This one warns. Over and over, Israelite law says, remember you were slaves in Egypt. Therefore, don't crush the poor, don't cheat the migrant, cancel debts sometimes, leave grain in the corners. That is moral judo. You take national trauma and flip it into empathy legislation. You don't invent that out of thin air. You inherit it from pain. That's also why the Exodus keeps getting remixed by the oppressed. African American spirituals, liberation theology, civil rights rhetoric. People hear that drum and say, that's my beat. Whether the sea split 10 meters or 10 metaphorical miles, the ethos is reinforced by a kind of negative evidence. A people who keeps telling a story that embarrasses their ancestors probably isn't composing pure propaganda. They're carrying a bruise. The numbers mini rant. Ancient texts love numbers the way influencers love superlatives. 600,000 men on foot doesn't read like a census. It reads like a ton of us. If you scale it down to, say, a few clans, hundreds or a few thousand, the silence of the desert becomes plausible. Nomads are archaeologically sneaky. Leather, reeds, and small fires don't hold press conferences 32 centuries later. So a micro-exodus isn't a cop-out. It's a model that fits human behavior, logistics, and the actual dirt. What about the conquest? The biblical follow-up says blitzkrieg. The ground says mosaic. Some towns fall, many don't, and a burst of small villages pops up in the highlands. That looks like gradual social change. Locals reorganizing, maybe ditching city lords, carving out a new identity with some new rules. No pigs? New house forms? A different god. It's less total war and more settlement sim. Again, the micro-exodus plus local formation build fits. So, were the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt? Here's the no BS answer. Enslavement of Semitic peoples in Egypt? Yes. Solid evidence. A distinct group that later becomes Israel experiencing oppression there? Very plausible. A single massive cinematic exodus of 1 million plus with plagues and a national desert roadshow? The receipts aren't there. A smaller exodus, or several, whose memory became the spine of a people's identity. That's the best fit for the evidence we do have. Call it mythic history, not fantasy, not documentary. A true core scaled into a charter story. Why skepticism isn't cynicism. Being skeptical isn't about sneering. It's about weighing. If you need the blockbuster version to be literally exact, archaeology won't back you. If what you need is historical plausibility consistent with known Egyptian practices, Semitic presence, and Israel's emergence in Canaan, then yes, a real oppression to freedom arc probably sits behind the saga. And the ethical payload, remember your chains, so you don't forge new ones, doesn't depend on the ticket stubs. If you're looking for the exact frame-by-frame miracle montage, history won't give you that. If you're looking for whether the ancestral memory of bondage in Egypt could be rooted in real, lived oppression by a Semitic subset that later helped define Israel's identity, that's not only possible, it's likely. And maybe that's the point. The story's power never came from measured Nile depths or shell counts in Sinai. It came from a people who decided their most important memory wasn't conquest, but liberation, and who kept telling everyone, because we were slaves, we will not act like pharaohs. In a world addicted to pyramids, literal and metaphorical, that's an origin story worth keeping, even as we keep the historian's flashlight on.